Welcome to this audio session recording taken at the Agroforestry Show, which was organised in September 2023 as a partnership between the Woodland Trust and the Soil Association. For more session recordings, go to agroforestryshow.com or explore and subscribe to the Agroforestry Show YouTube channel. Enjoy!
Around a third of farmland in the UK is managed by tenants. So the question of agroforestry on tenanted land remains the same wherever you are. Agroforestry needs to work for landowners and tenants alike. Current tenancy agreements are often inflexible and prohibitive as regards planting trees, but new agreements are possible with landlord buy-in. On a practical level, planting trees on tenanted land represents unique challenges for agroforestry. For example, who owns the trees? Who owns the crop? What happens to those assets when the tenancy ends? What is the value of the trees? If a traditional tenancy, how will dilapidations work? This afternoon, we shall debate how landowners and tenant farmers can work to overcome these challenges. With our speakers from the end there, Stephen Briggs, Tenant Briggs, who's a tenant farmer and an agroforester and a Nuffield scholar, and representatives from the landlord and tenant sector, namely George Dunn, CEO of the Tenant Farmers Association, and Jeremy Moody, Secretary and Advisor to the CAAV. All our speakers are knowledgeable on landlord and tenant law and issues that can arise. I'll just say a word on how our session will run. Stephen will speak first, as he needs to be leaving us in about 40 minutes. So please, if you have any questions specifically for Stephen, please ask after his session finishes. He has about 10 minutes after that. And then George will speak next, and Jeremy, and then we'll have a Q&A session where we have roving microphones. But please feel free. It's a very interactive session. And I know it's very, very hot. So please just feel free to ask questions as we go through. So handing over to Stephen first.
Just I suppose as an explanation. So I'm a first generation farmer. My wife and I took on a tenancy with Cambridgeshire County Council as a local authority back in 2007 on a farm that was had been worked hard, I think is the way to describe it, growing wheat, oilseed rape, and sugar beet and potatoes. The soils were fairly exhausted. We wanted to transform that farm into something that was more ecologically sustainable, more diverse in terms of ecology, cropping, and business opportunities. We were fortunate that we negotiated, unusually, a 15-year farm business tenancy at the outset, where the normal farm business tenancy was and still remains 5 years for the county council. But we're eternally grateful to being able to go and start farming on a rural holding which is about 13,000 hectares, which is about 250 farms. I learned the other day that Cambridgeshire is the second largest landowner in East Anglia, which is an interesting statistic after the MOD. Not sure what that says. So we moved our farming system, converted it to an organic production, and got a 15-year farm business tenancy. And quite soon afterwards, realised that our soils were in such a state that we needed to do something about soil erosion. As someone that trained as a soil scientist and had spent quite a number of years working overseas in Africa, I was aware of tropical agroforestry, and I wanted to see if we could do something with a temperate agroforestry system on the farm that we were tenanting and now farming. So I approached the landlord and said, we want to put an agroforestry system in, and we had to build the business case for it. In effect, we built the business case by opting to go for fruit trees because they could give us an economic return within the 15 years of our tenancy. There were some red lines that our landlords put in place from the word go. And they were partly tenancy related and partly about the ease under which they could relet the holding if we decided to quit or at the expiration of our tenancy agreement. One of those was around permanence. If you're planting trees, it's a long-term project. So we had to sign a document at that time that said if we were to quit or at the end of our tenancy, we've got to take the trees with us. So effectively, we have to remove the trees and turn it back to agricultural, arable land. And that was partly about the ease of being able to relet that farm to other potential tenants. The second question was about drainage, actually. On a farm where we have tile drains across every field, the landlord wanted to find out whether or not planting trees was going to damage that permanent drainage infrastructure. And I managed to find some research which demonstrated that the system that we were putting in place, that wouldn't be the case. And actually, 15 years later, that still is the case. Our drains are running fine. In fact, our agroforestry land drains better than our non-agroforestry land. So we put in 4,500 fruit trees across 52 hectares in 2009. We've been organic ever since 2007. We've had a countryside stewardship and high-level stewardship scheme in place. And that's done really well. It's delivered increased productivity, building upon the business case we put forward initially. So we're running at about 25% increase on productivity. So better economics, better biodiversity. We've had 200% more bumblebees and hoverflies on the farm, 240% more bumblebees, 10% higher species richness, and an 8 species increase in red data book bird species. So it's delivered us a lot of what we were trying to achieve. Although those original concerns of the landlord remain in terms of being able to relet the farm and the permanence of the agroforestry crop. So where we are at the moment is that we own the trees as tenant. We funded and put the trees in place. The trees are, in effect, ours to take away and take with us. I would be hopeful that at the end of our tenancy, agroforestry would be a more widely recognised land use and that we could leave those trees in place and perhaps there is a tenant that wants to take them on after us in terms of legacy. So there are some issues around long-term tenancy and short-term tenancy. We actually surrendered our 15-year farm business tenancy in 2000, or after 10 years, because we built a farm shop and education centre on the farm and renewed our tenancy for another 15 years. So I've got a bit more time on that tenancy agreement. I've got about another 9 years, at which point I would hope that that we can leave those trees in place for a subsequent tenant. Looking forward, just to sort of finish, I guess I'm going to pose some questions to the following speakers, which is that government policy and us as farmers and land managers, we're all seeking sort of multifunctional land use and multifunctional outputs. We're all being asked to deliver more in terms of food security, biodiversity, climate change, resilience, etc. What we've tried to do on our own tenanted farm is very much to stack enterprises. So we have an arable system, we have an agroforestry system, we have pollinator strips and countryside stewardship with a bee enterprise. We now have a farm shop and a retail business and an education business. So we've very much stacked enterprises on the farm. And I think asking farmers and landowners to deliver those multifunctional outputs is asking a lot in terms of time, energy, capital, and expertise and knowledge. So if we're seeking those multifunctional outputs, perhaps we need to consider stacking different businesses and different people together on the same land bases. Just as we've stacked enterprises, I I would be first in the queue if someone said to me, I'll come and manage your fruit trees because I'm really good at fruit. And I'll carry on doing the other parts of the business, and we get better outcomes. The reality is that would effectively could be seen as a sublet, and that would breach my tenancy agreement. So if we want those multifunctional outputs, and especially where we're considering long-term projects like agroforestry, we need to think about arrangements which allow multiple parties to operate on the same land area to provide shared skills, capitals, and risks. Okay, I'm going to stop at that point. Hopefully that gives you a flavour of what we've done and where we've got to.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Jeremy, did you want to come in on that regarding the stacking systems?
Yeah, I don't think I'd necessarily talk about it as stacking, but there are already plenty of ways in which people come together to do things in different ways on the same unit of land. One of the things I was just thinking about was reflecting on a farm just west of Edinburgh. They've been 4 generations, they're landlord and tenants, arm's length completely. It was 250 odd acres. He was trying to make a rather hard arable farm work, so he was then contract farming other people's land. He has now moved into fruit under tunnels and a farm shop. His arable operation is now contract farmed by somebody else. And contract farming is classically a way by which a tenant gets somebody in on their land without breaching the agreement. If your fruit operation is big enough, and there are going to be issues of scale as to how many mouths you want to feed off any given unit and what's the underlying basis of value, then again, mixtures of partnership, you want to be careful about the arrangements, but you have the interest in that land for as long as you hold it. Provided you don't sublet, but you retain your management control in it, you can come to those other agreements in the way of that contract farming operation. So, and interesting on that Edinburgh farm, where they moved to once he started establishing the shop well now into 7 figures of turnover and with nursery attached, that's being taken out and put on a 50-year business tenancy, with the rest remaining on the old secure tenancy. So I think where we really are, and it's probably something where George and I will agree cheerfully with all of you, is actually it's about flexible identification of what are your business purposes, seeing how to do it, identifying the tools for it, drafting to do it, using the flexibility of common law as well as legislation, and arriving at a mutual answer. And I think quite a lot of what we're going to talk about later today, or this session, while any of us remain unbaked, is going to be around the fact that you involved the landlord in your concept from the beginning. So it became, to that extent, and we can talk about the end of tenancy issues later on perhaps, but to that extent, for the duration of the tenancy, the landlord is comfortable with you doing what you're doing, you're making money out of it, you're paying a rent from it, and you're earning an income from it. We're back to the basics of commerciality and business, rather than being obscured, as some people can be, by not thinking flexibly enough.
Just to respond to both of those points, from our perspective, we are always trying to ensure that our members, tenant farmers, are not disenfranchised from taking part in these types of arrangements. But what we abut against on a very regular basis is the conservatism in the sector, in that the usual way of doing things, the usual clauses, and I'll talk a little bit about that when I show you some slides a bit later, that there tends to be a lack of willingness to be less than conservative in approach to businesses. Some of that's about lack of trust, some of that's about needing to build trust. Coupled with that, though, there is a seemingly unlimited concern amongst landlords and those who advise them about taking risk. And it's when a landlord lets land, they receive a rent. There's no risk. There's not much risk in relation to that. Whereas once they get involved in more intricate types of arrangement, they're going to be involved in taking more risk. And what we find is that quite often those who are advising them will almost put them off from doing stuff because of the risk aspects and the way in which they need to protect themselves. Because actually, and I'll say this a bit later as well, in terms of the legislation, the foreign business tenancy legislation is effectively an open book for people to write the sorts of agreements that they want to write, by way of length, by way of user clauses, by way of alienation clauses about sharing occupation or subletting or whatever. But if I often say this, if we were to measure the breadth of the flexibility we have within the legislation as this whole tent, we are using that legislation to the extent of that blue chair in the marketplace, because lengths of term are routinely short, tenancies are routinely restrictive, and they have not created the degree of change that we hoped to have seen. And there's a real issue with the whole sector to become less conservative, be more risk accepting, but find ways to manage that going through the system. So I think that's really important.
I think I'd reiterate some of those comments in that, from our perspective as tenants, we were very, very clear about the business case and the business plan for the agroforestry. Equally, the same with building a farm shop and an education centre. Very clear about the business case and the rationale and the capital costs and the return on investment, etc. We have some quite strange clauses in our own personal tenancy. One being that we can't bring livestock onto the farm without landlord's consent. We're not allowed to create any joint ventures or contract farming arrangements without landlord's consent, of which they want a percentage of the return. So there are some quite, I don't know if they're unique, but specific arrangements. But I think my point was about that if we want these multifunctional outputs that we're seeking from farms, that actually we need multi-operator, need multi-occupier perhaps, and perhaps we need to think about how we can create marriages between people with different skills and different capital on the same land base. But that does require that flexibility in tenancy arrangements, which can at first sight be seen as subletting, but isn't always the case.
And quite frequently is not subletting. I mean, obviously you've got your particular clauses, and those are ones which I might well not see as positive in this particular context. But the critical thing is you've identified a business case which you happen over a period of years from what you say to have proven. So that gives everybody confidence. Not every business case that gets put up is necessarily a good case, but there are good cases. I think a challenge on any individual unit trying to do lots of things is scale and management distraction, which is where bringing in extra people can be a way of dealing with it if they've got the necessary skills or managing the investment. But if you're trying to do everything on quite a small unit, then actually it may be that multifunctionality isn't where you're going. Different answers for different people in all of this is really where I would be on this one. So, but the tool, as George said, the tools are there, and I would fully encourage their creative use.
Is that a challenge back to me, Jeremy? Well, I mean, I think in a marketplace where we have a situation where it's the landlord, let's be honest, holds sway, because there are many more people after opportunities to use land than there are people offering land. Landlords don't have to be innovative. They don't have to be looking at creative ways of using agreements. There will always be plenty of people who are willing to take an agreement on whatever terms. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a thing. And therefore, in my mind, the creativity needs to come more from the landlord community and those who are advising them, Jeremy's members, for example. And we are beginning to see in some of the larger institutional landlords, and it's nice to see the church commissioners present in the room. Sorry to call you a guy. But where previously they had taken a pretty short-term restrictive approach to life, but increasingly they're looking to see how they can use their portfolio in a much more imaginative way, which delivers value to the nation and delivers value to the individual tenant as well. And this is not about the traditional who's getting one over somebody else in the landlord-tenant debate. Is the tenant walking away with some of the landlord's reversionary interest, or is the landlord getting more rent? This is about creating a bigger pie for everybody, and therefore both parties need to gain from this. So it's about being collegiate, being collaborative, rather than reverting to our old positions of being in our trenches. And I think Stephen wants to come back.
Well,
on
I was
that
going to
one.
say, I'd like follow on directly and agree entirely that these should not be seen as zero-sum equations. We can look at, if you look at agreements, whether they're tenancies or they're contract farming or other agreements between owners and farmers, the issue is, do these agreements add value? Do they transfer value? Or do they destroy value? And you can look at all those examples of ones that do any of those three. And people will give value in order to get an opportunity, as George is saying. But some of these agreements actually positively can operate to destroy value. But we're looking at a wider, much more diverse marketplace. Stephen has come forward with a particular bundle of propositions on his unit. Many people are just looking to rent land for the enterprise that they pursue. Extra grazing for their dairy farm, extra land for the arable. That's what they want to do. They're not, that's their business. They've chosen to be good and specialist, just as somebody else might choose to be diverse with a wider range of operations, balancing out risk across that quite possibly, but equally spreading management where it might not always be right to spread it, spreading investment. The whole variety of balances that different people will arrive at different answers, and we need the lot.
I guess this is an observation, having been a tenant for the last 15 years and looked at various tenancy agreements, in that most of the clauses that are in the majority of tenancy agreements, I appreciate that some will be different, most of those clauses will be punitive clauses. So they will require compensation for something that's either bad practice or something that's been reduced in value or degraded or whatever. And, manurial values was a case in point there as an example. Generally speaking, there are very few rewarding clauses in most tenancies where you've increased biodiversity or you've increased soil quality or you've increased water quality. That they don't tend to exist. And I think it's something that needs exploring. We've got scientific evidence that we know we've increased biodiversity and we've increased soil quality on the farm, but I know I'm not going to get any reward for that. Now, in the world of equity, is that an equitable arrangement when I've improved somebody else's asset? Discuss.
Yeah, well, there is growing experimentation in these areas, mostly at the moment on soils. And one of the things a few years ago, the old tenancy legislation was extended to recognise soil improvement as a potential head of claim. Probably not a lot of experience in tenants actually seeking to claim for it. There's been a level of experiment among FBTs with clauses for improving soils and the potential for compensation arrangements. Again, early days for experimenting. I would say, yes, much less around, if you like, biodiversity and so on. When, of course, it comes then to the end of the tenancy, the question is, what is the value you're leaving for the next occupier or to the landlord? Now, some of these things may actually have no monetary value. And that's the misleading thing about the natural capital language, is it doesn't necessarily bring the money that capital might suggest. And I think that's something that, again, markets may evolve and develop more on that one. The other challenge with some of these, and it's the same with outcomes-based schemes that DEFRA has been playing with on tests and trials and so on, is a very big thing for a farmer to go out on an outcomes basis scheme, because nature is a very fickle thing. And if you are in the year where whatever species it is you're supposed to be creating has just plummeted, or your base year was proves to be in a very odd year, then again, it's hard to see that those things are necessarily equitable. And if I were advising you at that point, I'd be wondering, well, how many eggs have you got in that basket that you can stand that extra level of risk? So, again, the arguments can be put simply. The practical realities are actually slightly more nuanced in this. But I remember this coming home, really looking at a Cotswolds farm, very, very proud of the grey partridge, doing a great deal for the grey partridge. And this is going back some years, because it's 2012, which had a very cold and wet June, and grey partridge numbers just plummeted. If that was the year that somebody went out on producing grey partridge numbers, vast amounts of good work would have gone unrecognised, just by the chance of the season. You know, it's a peculiarly dry year, it's a peculiarly wet year, one way or another. So some of these things need... Ultimately, one of the interesting questions in testing all agreements is how are the parties going to react when the project is loss-making? People are quite good at learning how to split profits. Mutual greed is quite a driver. Talking through how you split losses is a real challenge for a relationship.
I'll just respond back to Jeremy on that, and then we'll sorry, Chair, we'll go. Yeah. I think there's a real need to reimagine the end of tenancy valuation side of life that Jeremy's talked about. I think what we've had traditionally doesn't fit with the new model that we need going forward. And why do I say that? So it's about what is the value we're looking at. So, for example, if you have a farm that becomes available to an incoming tenant, how supply chains interact with that farm are going to become a lot more complex going forward. So the supply chains might say, we're not prepared to deal with you unless you are doing this sort of thing for the environment, or this sort of thing for water quality, or this sort of thing for air quality, or this sort of thing for public access. We even already have banks saying to people, we're not going to lend you money unless you have an audit of how you're doing on things like restoring nature. And we have planning departments saying, well, we might be more lenient on you if you want the planning consent for X, if you're doing something on land elsewhere in relation to the natural environment. And I don't think the valuation community, sorry, Jeremy, is caught up with how you capture that sort of a value at the end of tenancy, because I think those things are going to become much more important. And as Stephen says, I very much hope when he gets to the end of his FBT that what he's done will be much more valued than it was when you went in to that arrangement in a few years ago.
Okay, Stephen does have to go in about 5 or 10 minutes. So if anyone has any specific questions for him regarding farming as a tenant, or any tenant farmers in the room want to speak, please do.
Hi, Stephen. Tom Beard, Catchment Sensitive Farming. I'm just thinking logistically about that original tenancy, the 15-year agreement you originally set up, signed. Did you think, I'm going to put dwarf stock in rather than, modern tall fruit trees, just logistically it'd be easier to get rid of them if something went wrong? And the other question I've got is, how do you actually sell your fruit?
Okay, so the choice of tree, as part, we decided that we wanted to put an agroforestry system in to deliver increased biodiversity, increased income, increased resilience, soil protection. And we looked at lots of different trees, nuts, timber, fruit, etc. And the reality is, within the confines of a 15-year agreement, the only thing that could give us a return on investment was going to be a short-term fruit crop. And then the size of the tree, or the type of the tree, was determined by the specification and layout. We actually went for a semi-dwarf, and that sort of works for our system as our M109 rootstock. I suppose the type of system was very much dictated by what we couldn't do within the lifetime of our tenancy. Where we sell all our fruit, initially we sold some wholesale. Now, having subsequently built a farm shop on the farm with agreement with our landlords, which actually is under a separate commercial lease. Another red line. And having done the business case for that, all our fruit is sold either fresh or as juice through the farm shop. So we do about 5,000 bottles of juice a year.
Okay, thank you. Question at the back there, lady with the blue top.
Hiya, Emily from Northumberland National Park. I was just...
Sorry, which national park?
Northumberland. Quite far away. I was just wondering if you had any issues around land classification when you brought in agroforestry, and if that was something you had to sort of think about in terms of stems per hectare and communicating that with your landlord.
So I missed it, and my apologies. The other red line that the landlord said is that whatever you do, the land must remain eligible for the Common Agricultural Policy. So if I'd planted a timber tree at the time, that would have resulted in that land being non-agricultural, and I would have had a dilapidation order put upon me for taking the land out of agricultural productivity. So that was another reason for picking. It really meant we had the choice of fruit, nuts, vines, or nursery crops. Nut trees were a possibility, but they would have taken a lot too long to come into production. So that was land classification. It all remains agricultural. In 2009, there was a CAP change which said fruit, vines, nuts, and nursery crops all become agricultural, and so we retain the land classification as agricultural by doing what we did.
So you didn't have to worry about stems per hectare because of the species?
Correct.
Yeah.
So it remains agricultural. And in fact, where we are now outside of Europe, as long as you comply with the Forestry Act, you can still plant anything you want as a perennial, irrespective of density, and that can remain agricultural land as agroforestry.
That's where I was going to point out that one of the things I was going to point out was that because fate has had the last laugh, that eligibility for the CAP ceases to be material within your timescale. And I think that's a point of interest. Again, 2008, you could enter trees into forestry on eligible land and retained eligibility, but that again is now history. But I think the really material point is that we will need, I think, suspect to come back to later on, is you're paying rent as a going concern on a going basis. You need income. It is vines, it is fruit trees, and so on, that even with a 3-year or so lag, actually start producing income. The longer term stuff has got a fearful in a sense, for almost any farmer. But with the tenant farmer as a commercial farmer looking to earn income and pay a rent, the absence of a running income has got to be a material issue. And so I think it drives you down the fruit, nuts, vines type route if you can stand that first 3 years.
Hi, Sasha Roberts from Nature Broking. I live in Perthshire, and the whole place is packed with tenant farmers, and they are often just put off the land in a fairly sort of arbitrary way by the landowners. What is the incentive for tenant farmers to start farming more regeneratively if they are only able to sign an agreement, a tenancy agreement for 5 years?
So length of tenancy is a real disincentive to use plain language. If you've only got a 5-year tenancy, you exploit that bit of land for the 5 years and then move off it, especially when there isn't a baseline at the beginning and the end which is enacted and monitored. We were fortunate in I managed to negotiate a 15-year initial tenancy on the basis that we wanted to do something regeneratively, and that was seen as a trick. Frankly, if I'm brutal about it, my landlords looked down their list of tenants and went, "Well, we haven't got one of those. We haven't got an organic farmer. We've put one on the list. That'll tick a box," and we beat 80 applicants to it. So that probably did me a favour, but. Yeah, I think there's a massive disincentive to do things regeneratively or agroforestry if you've only got a 5-year farm business tenancy, unless there are transfer clauses, unless any benefit could be transferred between one tenant and a subsequent tenant. And I think that might overcome some of the problems. It's certainly something that is being looked at as part of the agroforestry sustainable farming incentive, that actually those, because of its very nature with a tree crop being longer, you could transfer those between tenants.
When in fact the transfer clause is something which Evesham Custom has in the Vale of Evesham where I come from, and it's something which goes around. You've seen it in the Vale for so long, and still the Evesham Custom works well, so that could be something.
Hi, I'm Francesca from Numwell Home Farm on the Isle of Wight. I have to, I suppose, declare that I am one of Jeremy's members, but I'm also a tenant farmer. But I just wanted to say, actually, I'm not a tenant farmer. We're actually in a share farming agreement, and I was just interested to know whether you've heard of them and I, as a rural surveyor, hadn't come across them before. Obviously, it takes a more dynamic landowner because essentially it's a joint venture, but it has allowed us to develop a vision together that then going forward, he's willing to put investment into things like agroforestry. I think we would argue that he will actually end up doing quite a lot of the putting in the establishment costs if we can't get funding for it, and we will then manage it, as is the case with everything within our share farming agreement. And yes, it does take a dynamic landowner to do it, but I was just interested to know if you've heard of other.
I think you raise a really interesting point there. But so in my case, we own the trees, but actually, I'd be very comfortable if the landlord was to fund it and retain those as a capital asset, and as a tenant, I would get income from managing that capital asset during the life of its arrangement. And I think for some landlords, meeting their carbon, biodiversity, corporate social responsibility.
Our landlord's an airline pilot.
Yeah,
so.
Well, obviously different landlords of shapes and sizes. Quite often they have other interests and other business interests, and meeting some of those CSR requirements through that kind of approach. As I say, it's all about conversation and about using tenancy arrangements to meet those shared objectives.
I think it is just worth coming in further on this one without knowing the details of your arrangement, because share farming is a very loosely used phrase. If we just stay with joint ventures, and there are a number of these, and as you say, properly done, there is an exposure to greater risk, and they need a lot. There's a lot of care and attention to the detail of the agreement. There's a conventional model which is more like share land management, which is where the landowner comes in and says, I'm providing the land, you're providing the operation, and we find a way to divvy out the gross output between us. But there are structures, you see, where the farmer and the owner come together in a joint company, or indeed neighbouring farmers come together in a partnership or a joint company and invest and share results on the back of that. And where you are dealing there with a commercially minded owner who is willing to be engaged in risk, then these are viable models for people who like working with each other. And of course, one of the quirks in this is by no means every farmer likes somebody on their shoulder in that way. There's a cleanness to a tenancy that a landlord has got long-term issues and a lower level of risk. The tenant is doing the business. Not every tenant thinks his landlord's terribly good at farming, but different. We're dealing with the range of humanity and all the opportunities and finding ways for these arrangements to work. And there's some very interesting and useful models out there that are outside the landlord-tenant system. But all too, you leave two Britons alone with a field in the dark, and by the morning, one's become a landlord and one's become a tenant, because of the different outlooks on risk and income and energy and so on. But other vehicles are available.
I think Jeremy's little vignette there summed it up, really. Share farming's been around for a very long time, as has other types of joint venture, and we find within the Tenant Farmers Association that they are often talked about more often than they exist. And if I was being really cruel, it was the CLA's way to try and undermine the landlord-tenant system by suggesting there are other ways to do agriculture. But actually, when push comes to shove, what you often find is that the landowner doesn't want to take the risk, and therefore, as Jeremy says, you end up with a landlord-tenant situation.
But I would say agroforestry is not impossible on tenanted land, but you just need to have those conversations with your landlord about what your shared objectives are, and find a sort of common place. We've certainly made it work, and I would hope our landlord sees the benefits that it's brought. We're yet to have that conversation about end of tenancy and who pays improvements or compensation or fines and how easy that's going to be to re-let. But I'll let these two gentlemen debate that one at length.
Well, we shall have considerable fun doing that. Wish you well for this evening.
Yeah.
But I think
if I just finish answering the question first.
Well, I was going to say
he's already started.
The interesting thing here is that, of course, as you've said with the Vale of Evesham, tenancies and fruit have long been known. This isn't actually that much of an innovation at that level. Some of the longer-term projects may be more challenging. And
what I was going to say about share farming was where it's done well and where it's done with both parties coming together with both sides. And bear in mind, it's about two people operating separate businesses, but collaborating on this in the same space to do something together. And they take a bit of working through, and they take a bit of understanding, and take a bit of writing down, but they are a perfectly bona fide way to do the sorts of things that you're talking about. But they are rarer than they're talked about.
Okay, thank you. Has anyone got any questions so far?
Hi there. You talked a lot about there is flexibility in the system and there isn't, there's only a blue chair's worth of the potential used. But to somebody coming from outside the industry who's new to it, who doesn't even understand a lot of the terms that you've been using today, where do you go? How do you get access to these agreements that are available? How do you develop new ones? Have you got any suggestions?
Well, the first thing I would say is join the Tenant Farmers Association.
Are you on that? So I'm a forester, so we're
Yeah.
particularly looking at trees. So but obviously we need land. But do you welcome foresters as well as farmers?
We welcome people that use land when they don't own it, and we will find a way to assist you. And obviously, a lot of it's about signposting as well to other professionals that will be able to provide you with the necessary bespoke arrangements that you need to take things forward. And so that, yeah, I mean, I joke, but we do provide a service to our members, not just people who rent land for agricultural purposes, but people who use land, but they don't own it in the rural context. But you know, CAV members will be there. So if you've got a land agent locally who understands this stuff, they should be able to help you as well. Obviously, it's slightly more expensive than joining the TFA, I think, at the moment, but. So that would be a place to start.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I would just say to please Francesca exactly what Georgia said, which is turn to a CAV member.
Are there any more questions before we carry on?
I just wondered, with the new subsidy landscape, whether you think that sort of there's going to be quite a shift in terms of the willingness of landlords to put up the costs for agroforestry infrastructure for tenants to manage, such as you've been discussing.
Do you mean because the tenant is being subsidised by the system that the landlord will simply want that back in terms of rent or infrastructure costs? Is that what you're saying?
Or perhaps that the sort of there's less of a risk to take because the cost of planting trees is subsidised now. So perhaps that'd be something that landlords can take more responsibility for and ownership for, and then allow tenants to manage and crop.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we've got to remember that even if your landlord is a charity, it doesn't necessarily mean they have to be charitable to you when it comes to these sorts of conversations. So just because the government is giving a grant doesn't mean that the landlord is automatically going to be more benevolent in their approach to your business idea. So I think it's about... we have an old-fashioned view about the landlord-tenant system in that the landlord's benefit is rent. So the landlord should be entitled to rent, and the tenant should be able to profit from the holding in whatever way they wish to do that. And some of that is about getting grant from the state, some of that's about getting private finance, some of that's about the contracts that they strike with private individuals. But whatever the tenant is able to do to profit from that, or lose from that, as Jeremy would say, then there needs to be a share of that with the landlord. So we're not against the landlord getting more rent if the tenant is also doing well. But I don't think you're going to find a situation where landlords are automatically going to become more benevolent because the costs of establishing the crop are grant-aided.
Well, of course, grants for tree planting aren't new. So these issues have been around for a long time. Indeed, we're going to look at even the most recent scheme, UCO, being folded into enhanced countryside stewardship, wherever you may be on the prospective SFI for agroforestry. But granting for tree planting has been around 40 years and more. I think you then touch on two particular points then. The first one is not that many farmers are intuitively timber growers. Now, some are. Some can buy in the skills and have a forestry contractor look after them if they're doing it at any scale, rather than just small areas of amenity planting. But temperamentally, if you look back at all the old tenancy agreements, the copses in the fields are excluded, they're held back. The tenant begrudges the rabbits. But beyond that, that's the way the world has tended to divide. Now, people's minds may be broadening at the moment on all of this, But the other thing to pick out, and we'll doubtless come to end of tenancy compensation a little later, but where the tenant has done something with grant aid in some of these things, that grant aid can be a factor when coming to look at where you are at the end of the tenancy. And that then may mean that that's a factor which comes out at the valuation at the end. So you sometimes always be careful what you wish for, and the main aim is that you are earning a living and able to pay the rent for the life of the tenancy. And I think that keeping that business focus is something that I'd want people to do.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to carry on with your slides?
I can do that. I was just asked to produce a very small number of slides, so don't worry, it's not going to be death by PowerPoint in this heat. Just to nail a few top tips in relation to where we are on the whole issue of agroforestry and farm tenancies. So the first thing just to nail is that we do not need a change in the law. So we do not need legislative change to ensure that we can have a thriving agroforestry sector within the tenanted sector of agriculture. And specific reasons for that is that the definition of agriculture already includes tree planting where it is ancillary to agricultural use within the definition of agriculture within both the 1986 Act and there also within the 1995 Act. So traditional tenancies let under the 1986 Act up and including 30th of August 1995, and some by succession and some by assignment. Sorry, 31st of August. Well, yeah, sorry, Jeremy. I forgot how many days there were in August. And those that are after, from the 1st of September 1995 under FBTs, the definition of agriculture helps us in relation to ensuring that agroforestry, in all its forms, silvopastoral and silvoarable, can be considered to be agricultural support. Top tip one is don't look for changes in the law. We don't need them. But we do need a change in contracts, and this is what we were talking about earlier. Sorry, my slides seem to have run into each other a bit. So routinely, I see examples of contracts which have clauses such as the one you see on the screen. The tenant shall not plant any hedges, fruit or other trees, coppice, saplings, pollards, or underwoods. And there is a sort of, and Jeremy will bristle when I say this, laziness in the sector where the land agent will take out the standard FBT agreement that's been in their drawer for the past 25 years and just to say, here you are, Mr. and Mrs. Tenant, or Miss Tenant, you need to take this agreement. And I also get really frustrated when tenants are asked to produce business plans and applications for tenancies where they put in weird and wonderful things that they want to do, and then they get presented with the standard FBT agreement, which seems to belie everything that they've put into their business plan and why they were selected in the first place. So this requires a change of mindset amongst landlords and their agents to be more open-handed when it comes to the clauses of those agreements. And not just those which directly impact the issues around trees, but lengths of term. We were talking about that previously. So 85% of all new FBTs are for 5 years or less. And yes, some of them are rolling on a year-to-year basis, but doesn't give anybody the confidence to invest. So we need a change of mindset in relation to landlords and their agents. And we need a better, and this is where Jeremy will probably want to come in, we need better end-of-tenancy protocols. There's a sort of fear factor or laziness around the issue of dilapidations, and looking at Stephen's perspective, it's madness that he should be being required to remove the trees that he has put in to develop the system that he has got up and running. So we need to find a way forward, and the valuation profession, to my mind, just needs to reimagine the place of trees, the right tree in the right place, and how they sit within the farm landscape, and ensure that they have a right perspective of the value of those trees in the farm landscape as well, rather than just seeing them as an encumbrance, as an issue for dilapidation, as an issue for loss of value. So it was the three top tips that I was asked to just put down for discussion. Obviously, we've had a bit of discussion about them already. No doubt Jeremy will have some comeback on some or all of those.
Thank you. And as a land agent and valuer myself, I will now pass over to Jeremy to defend us.
I thought you were going to come back at that point. Well, George will know I'm entirely up for creative, flexible, use of agreements and looking at these things in a pragmatic and business-like way. And I think that's the starting point, is that if you go forward with a business proposition, it's not got to be one that's sitting there on the back of a brown envelope. It's actually got to be something that somebody else can believe you're going to do. And it's going to work. And you've tested it for risk and sensitivity and so on. And if you had to talk with a bank manager beforehand, you very probably had to do all of that. But it is just working it through, not just an inspired idea after the third pint. It is actually something that is capable of delivery, capable of earning, capable, and an important thing in many, particularly the larger projects, is just to assume they're going to take a year or more longer to deliver and a lot more money than you budgeted for to deliver, because the contractors who come to do things will always be more costly, they'll take longer. It's allowing for the fact that the world is a risky place and working through on that. At which point, if there's a project that both parties have confidence in, then splendid. We sit down then and look at what is it that really encapsulates the business agreement between them. Start from the business agreement and then work to what the legal agreement is, rather than, and this is where George and I are going to agree, rather than the other way around. Not imposing a straitjacket that may actually simply be irrelevant. And working at it, and if the answer's a particular one or the other of the various forms of joint venture or share farming, if that solves the deal for people, if it's properly working through a tenancy such that it allows, and again, there is nothing inherently novel, and we've both done work in the Vale of Evesham, and these things have been there for 150 years. The Evesham customs, sort of 1880s, into legal form, never mind all the colloquial varieties. So we start there and we start. I think then, of course, remember, right the way through this, if this is a tenant's investment, then that gets disregarded as its fact when it comes to rent review. So I come back tediously to my business income point out of all of this. The tenant is year in, year out paying rent for the land that he took. And you may stand it planting fruit trees, planting vines, whatever it might be, with their investment that you don't get your first fruits till 3 years and maybe then a couple more for them to come on strongly. That's a business choice you make to take that fallow period to start with. But it is something to watch and work through, and again, reassure your family that there's going to be breakfast on the table during those periods. These are the economic realities. But you are now looking at this as a project on land on which you are paying rent. If the trees devalue the land, you're still paying the same rent. If the trees render the land not earning income, you're still paying the same rent. So I think, again, it is just being clear-sighted about that as you go through. Then we come to the end of tenancy. And there is a problem here, I think, particularly as we move towards more serious trees. And I'm up for an open discussion about what markets recognise as value at the end of a tenancy. But we hit the Forestry Act first, which means that trees can be permanent. It can be a permanent change of land use. And if that's a change of land use at scale, that does, in current markets, in much of England at least, devalue land. Not necessarily in large areas of Scotland or wherever, but it depends which market you're in. And that is an issue to think through, and that's why, again, you want the landlord engaged and interested if you are looking at planting something longer term. So the landlord then, if we just take a hypothetical Stephen Briggs at this point, unable to answer as a landlord and certainly not himself at the moment, we come to the end of the tenancy. Is there a market in his part of East Anglia for somebody to rent those fruit trees and manage them as a business? You hit the issue of some things being so specialist that nobody else, the generality of tenants, who would be tenants, don't want to do them. At which point it may have no value. If it has a serious commercial value, or if it turns on contracts, and of course some people will have seen this of let's go north of Perth, go to where some of the Aberdeenshire milk farms were, and they no longer can get milk contracts. So being a dairy farm with all that fancy investment is a bundle of joy. There is no market for that. The contracts have gone. So again, some of these things may be too special for the market to pick up, or the market may have gone. And I'll join with George in terms equally of probably a shared analysis over where supply chains and so on can be more broadly in looking at these issues. But it may be that this is a perfectly good operation, that there will be 10 people out there perfectly willing to bid useful money to take on the management of established orchards that are moving into rotation. And that will be good, but that's something the landlord's got to think about. I think just to be cautious about a phrase Stephen was using, and I know exactly what he means, but it's not the right phrase. It serves a purpose, but it's not the right phrase. He doesn't own his trees. Anything you fix to land belongs to land. And that's the challenge all agricultural tenancy law has had to deal with since year dot. And different answers, the Middle Ages had emblements and so on as a particular answer. We move into the law of fixtures and other things. But you have to intervene, and the law intervenes in two particular... Well, it deals with rent, we've talked about that, and tenants' works get disregarded when it gets to rent, which is where I was making the point earlier on. We then get to end of tenancy, and at that point, that's where classically, and this is where we've been for 200 years, where the tenant has improved a farm, then there's a claim for compensation. You know, we talked about dilapidations, but there's a claim for compensation for the tenant's improvement, whether it's the value he's added to the holding or the additional value it offers to an incoming tenant, and there are different ways of tackling the issue. And if what you have done there then adds value that is recognisably there in the marketplace, so the next person coming in will pay a higher rent because of all the work you've done to improve the land, the drainage you've put in, whatever it might be, or indeed you are saving an incoming tenant from an awful lot of work because your fruit trees are already established. He doesn't have to wait 3 years for them. Then that's value. But if the market doesn't see a pounds, shillings and pence value in it, or it's too special, then your work suited you. It was your business proposition. You've earned what you can from it, opportunity and risk. But there may not be an end of tenancy value. So what the landlord is saying, Cambridgeshire County Council in this case, at this point is saying, we'll deal with your trees as though they were a tenant's fixture. And I know this is going to be bizarre because basically taking those trees out is probably not going to be good for them. But he's saying, I want the farm clear so that I've got the clearest reletting market at the end of that. Now, actually, where you go is you then offer the fixtures to the landlord. The landlord may then choose to buy them. He's reserved discretion at that point. Equally, of course, that discretion will be there in the marketplace anyway, as a matter of practice. If good income-earning fruit trees were there and there were good tenants wanting to take them, somehow most people would arrive at a pragmatic answer around that. But there is a legal framework around tenants' fixtures like that. But strictly, at the point the trees grow, they're the landlord's trees, but the tenant has a couple of protections around that for his value and effort in that. But when we come to the end of the tenancy, it's looking at the world in whenever Stephen's tenancy ends, 2032 or whenever it might be, in whatever circumstances that are holding at that time. And that, again, is his business risk for his business choice. There is, the issue of carbon is on the whole a low-value issue in the moment in the agricultural world. But let's just take some trees. Let's say that the landlord has been very happy for the tenant to plant some trees because at the end of that 15-year tenancy, the landlord gets back trees that are 14 years old. Another 10 years on, they might actually start putting on useful volumes of carbon. The trees probably are not significantly compensated because they were probably planted with a lot of grant aid, which would remove that element. But let's say there's an associated woodland carbon guarantee agreement. And under an FBT, but not an 86 Act tenancy, that is capable on the right terms of being an intangible advantage and compensatable. That might be an agreement that a landlord could see significant value in if there is still value in carbon at that point. But that's where we're saying, we're looking ahead at 2032. But a lot of these things are not yet expressing themselves in the marketplace. They may be beginning to build confidence into current values. Whether a farm with more diversity will sell better than a farm with less diversity is the question you're beginning to reach. Now, but the place where I would take you is where George was talking just now, which is where you are more likely to get an Arla milk contract or sell your beef better because of the story that goes with it. That then is potentially something that people will pay more rent for. But the point I'm making to you is it's entirely a question of fact, not of aspiration.
And I'm just trying to make the point, sorry, loud voice.
I know you are.
that way of measuring, I think, is extremely short-sighted and really damages relationships between landowner, George, Kate McIver, Redwood Hay Farm, Tamar Valley. We haven't yet met, but we have worked together over many years. Thank you so much. That this just perpetuates a heartless culture. The life of a tenant farmer, and often the way the tenant farmer is treated by the landowner, I refuse to use the word lord because many of these people are not in the House of Lords. Landowner should be a relationship as within nature, symbiotic relationships of respect. And the landowners should be able to have a long-term view which goes way beyond what is on a balance sheet. That is my point.
And I doubt either of us dissent from that. But nonetheless, when you come to something, and let us say the landowner, want to talk about it that way, then relets the farm, that outgoing is what the ingoer would be expected to pay for as an incoming tenant, quite usually.
But the thing is, with shorter FPTs, I'm so sorry to interrupt.
No, let me just, in a moment, give me sort of 25 seconds. The ingoer, you're asking the ingoer to find from his resources the value that you are looking for.
No, I'm not. I'm asking the landowner to actually carry some of the risk, look ahead. Of course those trees will be sequestering carbon. Of course they are going to be encouraging greater biodiversity. Of course there is going to be complex root structures developing really important soil biology that anyone could think ripping those trees out is a good idea. They need their brains tested.
No,
seriously, it's appalling.
Sorry, what they have preserved in terms of their agreement and their situation, and I'm not party to that agreement, what they've preserved is a position that allowed him to plant the trees in the first place. Are there risks in trees? Yes. A drought, a quarter of France's trees are now, after 4 out of 5 hot, dry summers, at extreme drought risk. We've had Storm Arwen. We're felling vast areas of trees for tree diseases in this country. There's a risk side to all of this. The California offsetting scheme, the state-run reputable offsetting scheme, has reckoned that in 7 years it's burnt its centuries worth of fire buffer.
There are many reasons for all of that. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. But the many reasons are all part of the commercial matrix.
If I try and interject to try and somewhere in between, Kate, I absolutely get where you're coming from because taking a biblical perspective, to whom much is given, much is expected. And people that have got land, people who have been given or gifted or land, should take a holistic responsibility of that asset. And yes, finances are part of that, but they need to ensure that they're looking after the piece of land that they have been given.
Thank you.
I was amazed the other day. I was sat in a meeting with a landlord's agent where we were talking about a succession tenancy, and where my member was eligible and suitable to be the potential successor of the holding, and I was being accused by this landlord's agent who was acting for a client whose land had been gifted down the generations since the year dot. I was being accused of being entitled in my approach because I was advocating on behalf of my member who was eligible and suitable to be the successor. So I reflected back to that individual that it's a bit rich coming from someone whose land has landed in their lap. So I get exactly where you're coming from, and what we would say, Kate, about that is that there's a space for the public sector to nudge people to do the right thing. So how they are treated as to tax, and we've had a tax consultation recently about that, how they are treated as to planning, how they're treated as to regulation, should nudge them to do the right thing, even if they themselves do not wish to do the right thing by the wider interests of the public in relation to that land. And in terms of, quite often in the debate around tenants losing access to land for landlords to come in and do other stuff, sometimes with private finance, sometimes with public finance, we say to those with the private finance, are you happy that a tenant farmer has been harmed in the furtherance of your arrangement with this landowner? Oh, crikey, no, we're not happy about that. Well, it's part of your corporate social responsibility to make sure that people are treated fairly in this system. But sadly, Kate, that at the end of the day, there will be many, many situations around the country where it comes down to pounds, shillings, and pence. And that's an attitude which still pervades the whole of the economy within which we operate.
Okay, thank you. Are there any more questions for our two panellists?
I feel like there's been quite a lot of agreement between George and Jeremy, so I hope I'm trying to provoke a little bit of disagreement.
Excellent.
You've both talked about, I suppose, introduce myself, so Oliver from the National Trust, but I've also worked in private practice as a land agent and also a member of the CAV and RICS, so withering glance from George is probably coming shortly. But you've talked about the factors driving change in the market and how our current legislation is probably fit for purpose but needs broader interpretations. What are the key drivers to help change that marketplace beyond legislation? I suppose we've got tax, markets. What can change some of those cultural habits?
So tax is the big driver, and obviously we've dipped our toe in the water with the Treasury consultation, and Jeremy and I take a completely different view as to at least one aspect of that consultation document. But tax is a significant driver, and how we use tax to encourage landlords and to do the right thing in the environment. But I also think that culturally, and it goes back to what you were saying, Sarah, about coming to this fresh, if you like, because a lot of these discussions that we're having about value, about tenants' fixtures or tenants' improvements or dilapidations or risk, they all happen up front. They're not conversations that you have at the end of the 14 or 15 years or 20-year agreement. So almost immediately, Jeremy talked about, is there a market for this stuff? Well, in the same way as you might consider putting up a chicken shed, or you might consider doing a pig enterprise, or you might consider doing llama walking, or something where perhaps the valuation community feels a little bit more comfortable because they've got comparables for that sort of stuff and they can think about valuations. Then those markets can go wrong. The poultry market can disappear. People maybe don't want to walk llamas anymore, or alpacas or whatever. But it's almost like there's an automatic barrier comes down when we talk about things like agroforestry or the issues around natural capital, that automatically, it's too risky. Whereas actually, we just need to think a little bit more flexibly about how we can manage that risk in the environment within which we're operating. So I really think that the cultural change needs to come from the advisors to the landlord community to give them much more confidence that what they are doing can be managed in a realistic way, rather than just saying the answer is no, now what's the question?
Yeah, I think culture is part of it, and again, I would go more widely than advisors, because very often you're responding to the culture of the advised at this point. But no, let's take a look. I see the remainder of the 2020s as a fascinating period of prospective massive change. And it is the recasting, a significant part of this is the recasting of how government engages with agriculture. And we have this year in England seen the end, and it's an important word, of entitlements. The government policy can be boiled down effectively, I think, into two propositions. And the first one, farming is to look to itself as a business and make its business decisions. That's where you answer the chronic productivity, efficiency, profitability challenge that farming faces across the board, and where tenants are critically at the centre of that. And then they're coming back and saying, we're recycling the money, so we're making you offers for the change that we, the government, would like to see made. But that point now, where land is taken by tenants for its business proposition and use to them, I think now gives a prospectively, as the markets feel their way into these processes of change, that then, I think, starts driving quite significant change in who is farming, what land, how, and then the kinds of agreements that flow from that opens up opportunities for good and interesting people to expand, new people to come in, and after 30 years' worth of area payments simply rewarding occupation of land. And I think we now move, in England, at least on this one, into a very interesting period. And if we get it right, we'll have a more economically vibrant agriculture. It is possible that people simply choose to take the pain, and that is the worst outcome out of this. And that's critically is where I would then place the call for advisors to help people take the positive choices in this, and managing change properly with dignity and humanity in all of this, because this is difficult for some, it's opportunities for others, and how we manage all this But that's where I see it. I would add to George's issue of culture, I would then add how economics can change people's views of what is feasible. We've gone through some major times of change before like this when people have had to change. And it's that moment, and we may be at the edge of one of those moments now. And then as we look, thinking of Perth and the rest, as we look at the other parts of the United Kingdom following, Northern Ireland having got rid of basic payment by 2026, Scotland starting in 25, 26, 27, Wales starting its change from 25, but England broke the link. We are now in a delinked world in England. Some people have a run-off pension, but actually now the decisions we make about land this autumn are business decisions alone.
Thank you, Jeremy. We have a few questions over here. And the people at the back, if you want to come in, please do. We've got lots of seats at the front.
I was just going to give a little landlord perspective. We've heard a lot about tenants. Let's just not forget that landowners, landlords, whichever you want to call them, are usually there for the long term. Tenants pass through for various reasons. They come and go, whether it's a short-term tenancy, whether it's death, whether it's failed business, whatever. The point I want to make is, and it's from personal experience in East Anglia, and I will say I am a CAV member, Jeremy, so I'd better declare that interest. Back in the 80s, the landowner I'm thinking about granted access for RSPB and other organisations to come on and monitor various rare species, okay? And then suddenly, through the back door, oh, look, we've got a triple SI. We can have no development. We can't do what we like. This very same thing could happen very easily under this agroforestry and all these other schemes where the tenant or the landlord, landowner, occupier, whatever, would create something quite special, stick it in a scheme, 10 years, 20 years, rolls by, you've got a nice bit of habitat, and then all of a sudden, you've got a designation. That's going to hurt the landowner significantly. We've got a situation in East Anglia where you can't even put extensions to houses, let alone new farm buildings in land that's in this, well, Stone Curlew buffer zone, Stone Curlew Triple SI area in East Anglia. That's a real issue. So landowners will be cautious about granting consents to tenants to do these things. They've got to think about the long term.
And indeed, some of that was illustrated earlier on by the reference to clauses protecting eligibility for the CAP. There is no certainty in policy over the length of a longer-term business. One of the more striking things was a leaked paper from the European Commission a couple of years ago about forestry. And it shocked the Scandinavian forestry interests enormously. Companies like Cellulosa Svenska with 2.6 million hectares of commercial forestry, when the Commission's proposal at that point was that nobody could fell timber because it was to be kept for its carbon, which is not where the economic value lies. And at that point, entire business models could collapse around that with that change. But you have to make your business decisions in the world as you are. If you permanently start at every fear, you'll never get anywhere, and nobody will ever venture on anything, and nobody will ever do anything. And I think that's, it's keeping these things in perspective. And I'm familiar with the Stone Curlew issue but if it's the Breckland, I'm familiar with that one. And that's obviously one of the things that's concerning everybody involved in biodiversity net gain agreements, what happens at the end and so on in that. But you have to make your business decision at the time on what you can practically and realistically envisage as opportunity and risk.
And I think as well, just to add to that, I share your concern, and going back to even agri-environment agreements where you move land from arable into pasture and then you suddenly fall foul of the environmental impact assessment regulations because you've been in there for so long. And I think there's a wider question here about how we manage designations, and what we said to Natural England recently about the West Pen with SSSI is simply drawing a line on a map doesn't make any difference to the landscape or the biodiversity or to the scientific interest. What we need is to allow that line on the map to lever in some benefit for the people who are there rather than restriction. And similarly on Dartmoor, and Jeremy's on the Dartmoor review, looking at what Natural England are doing there in terms of just giving one type of medicine, which is stock reduction for the management of those SSSIs, where actually there's a whole range of things that you can do to improve those environments. So I think there's a wider question here about, yes, we should be protecting special things. I don't think I would go as far as to say we shouldn't be thinking about protecting stuff which is good for the nation. But if you are going to draw a line around a map, if you are going to designate something, then lever in some benefit for that rather than just disbenefit, which is what it currently is.
Because you're doing two things, and I must stay stum on Dartmoor for these purposes.
Jeremy, please. No.
But you are levering away in this with such a designation. You're levering away a block of property rights, as you've indicated, and granting people short consents. And listening to West Penwith, short consents to do what they've always been doing. That's been part of the landscape that they've got, and I think that there's an issue very much around that. But it's also that these areas frequently have competing public interests. So you are competing, and West Penwith would be a good example. The visibility and preservation of archaeology can be dramatically in conflict with some of the SSSI reasons for designation. Public access comes along again. The interests of the local community and economy. And how we manage trade-offs in all of this is, I think at the moment, a very interesting public policy question.
Okay, thank you. We have 10 minutes left, so if there are any more questions.
For me, the elephant in the room remains the 95 Act and the length of tenancies. Stephen was very fortunate, in my view, to have a 15-year tenancy because you can work with 15 years. You can't work with one. And we worry about the degradation of our soils and falling yields. It's a result directly of the 95 Act. And we need to reinterpret it, and we need longer tenancies. Baroness Rock has recognised this. I hope the industry as a whole does.
Yeah, and I would disagree and agree with you in equal measure. So, as I said earlier on, I don't think the legislation is the problem, because you can have 999-year leases subject to Law of Property Act and all that, but you can have whatever length of term you like. But the issue is that the market is not delivering anything like a sensible length of term to the tenant farmer. The TFA a few years ago asked all landlords, what would encourage you to let longer? And the one sensible answer that I had back was from a land agent who happened to be working for Savills, who said, let my clients lock in their capital taxation position on day one of a lease, and they will let for as long as you want them to. Because if they know their capital is not going to be touched by any subsequent chance of the exchequer for however long that lease takes place, then they're going to let long. And I said, that's fine. We'll be happy to back that, but we want an initial long term to begin with. So you're not just offering a rolling annual tenancy or whatever that is sufficiently long term. And sadly, the market is stacked against us. As I said earlier, there are many more people looking for land than there are people offering land, so landlords can afford to let short. But we do need to find ways in which we can nudge them to longer term agreements. And some of the institutions, the likes of the Duchy of Cornwall, Duchy of Lancaster, Church Commissioners, Crown Estate, we are having productive discussions with them about looking at longer lengths of term. The Duchy of Cornwall already does that routinely. But you're right, there needs to be a step change. We allowed the pendulum to swing too far in the opposite direction.
Okay, any more questions?
Thanks. There's been a lot of talk about evaluating, at the end of term tenancy and the value of that tenancy on the economics and the market rate. But it strikes me, in the world that we're living in, with the immediacy of climate change and the insecurity of long supply chains and the breakdown of those, that is there the potential to bring in an analysis of resources and for there to be a shared community responsibility that both the tenant and the landlord has in order to try and do what you can as individuals to provide resources for a community that might not be able to carry on importing everything that it needs from around the country and from abroad? And isn't that something that we kind of urgently need to look at in this model?
And I think I would say what I said in answer to the previous question from Kate earlier, which was, this is where the space is for government to create the nudge bars, if you like, to make sure that people do go down those routes, because frankly, it's not going to happen by osmosis. It's not going to happen by the market delivering a solution to that. So we need to understand what's important, and we need to create the necessary levers and nudges from a public sector perspective at the right scale to ensure that the sorts of questions that you have are properly answered.
I think one of the challenges in this is the difficulty of moving from story to calibrating answers, to defining agreements that capture what you want to capture, that measure usefully what you want to measure, so that things are then handed out as you would like them to be handed out. All the while I think, and probably this is where at one point I think your question would agree with how I'm looking at things, we are at the prospect of very substantial change on a lot of these areas. And one of the difficulties, in fact, with longer term agreements is managing the flexibility to adapt to what hasn't been foreseen. But I think moving from broad concept to something that people are willing to live with when it goes wrong on them as a model is the real challenge in trying to crystallize what you're saying. And that ultimately comes back, if it's between landlord and tenant, I don't know I want to venture more widely than that at this point, but if it's between landlord and tenant, that turns on the strength of the personal relationship. Do they like each other enough? Are they pragmatic enough? Do they have enough perspective? And I'll give you an example in a moment, to be able to say, well, that was a very silly agreement. Now here's what we want to do. And the example I would give is you have a lot of latitude under the 95 Act to illustrate one of the many areas of latitude, but one of the areas people experimented with at the beginning was linking the rent on arable farms to the price of wheat. And I can think now of a South Country holding where in 2011, the answer on that farm, because of the very dry conditions and the price of wheat that then held in a slightly less global market than we have now, the rent on that farm would have gone to well towards 300 and more an acre. However, the yield was 1.25 tons. And landlord and tenant were big enough each to look at each other and say, well, that's a very silly outcome. But each, well, in this case, the landlord could have held the tenant on the rack. And it's thinking about, there's almost always something in an agreement you've never thought about that sod's law there says then happens. And so it's the caution about how you develop that concept is, I think, one of the things that would take quite a lot of working through, testing for sensitivities, going back to my earlier point, testing for losses. You're making, we're in the interesting move where pressures for resilience tends to mean, therefore, more costly supply chains, and the competition then for people who are hard pushed to pay for food, reacting to more costly supply chains. A whole lot of tensions that not everybody wants to express, but would have to be worked through in things like this.
Okay, thank you. One more question, the lady there.
Hi, I'm Laura from the Woodland Trust. Thank you. It's been really interesting. I work with farmers within Wales. I just wanted to do a bit of myth busting, though. There's been quite a bit of study done by Savills, not related to the Woodland Trust at all, on land prices over the last 5 or so years, comparing farmland and woodland. And there's a year-on-year annual income shows increase income for forested and wooded land, and also resale value is also greater on woodland. So I think that's one thing to just be really clear about, is that, you know, the market is there for woodland and forested land and agroforestry land. It's not going to devalue, and the market's showing that.
Probably just to come back briefly, it depends very much which part of the country you're in. If you're in Mid Wales, then clearly forestry use is a direct competitor that's outbidding farmland. It's been that case in West Coast of Scotland for some years. If you go into East Anglia, you'll find that really quite a challenging proposition to try to sell. It's very difficult also in these markets to distinguish enoty value from some of the other values we've been trying to add today. And that's quite, again, is a challenge for analysis in all of this. But if there are now some, particularly for Wales and Scotland, less so for Northern Ireland and much of England, But in Wales and large parts, even arable Aberdeenshire, you are now watching commercial forestry uses now bid successfully against arable uses.
This was a study across Scotland, Wales, and England, and multiple sites across the whole. So, and we're still coming out as profitable and higher resale value.
Yeah, I think I know the study that you're talking about, and it depends on what woodlands are woodlands. I mean, some people are buying woodlands and then they're cutting them down into like little half-acre plots and selling them to, would-be amenity people who just want a bit of woodland. So that does skew the price quite considerably, and they're taking an average. So I think we've got to be careful from different parts of the country where we look at the prices for that. Is there one last question before we finish?
I just wondered what could be done in terms of the sort of advising DEFRA on the legislative framework to ensure that there's a little bit more confidence in terms of, for both landowners and prospective tenant farmers in the value of agroecological and agroforestry infrastructure on farm. Aside from woodlands on farms, in terms of sort of shelter belts and hedgerows and infield alley cropping. I just wonder what could be done there to reassure people that it will hold its value, not just in terms of sort of the resilience of the intercropped arable or silver pasture, but also I suppose some of various effects, being a crop in itself, perhaps being eligible for subsidies, and that those subsidies will actually continue on into the future. So I just wondered what could be done to tighten up the legislative framework, if you could be advising DEFRA on that.
First thing, actually, don't change much. Change unsettles people in these circumstances. The devastating impact on confidence among owners that came from the combination of tax and tenancy law changes in the 1970s echoed for quite a long time afterwards. There's still people who will hear the chains rattle, but for 10 or 20 years afterwards, that was a very potent thing. The 95 Act laid an awful lot of that to rest, and that's quiet. Again, similarly, in Scotland, a lot of people are very, very troubled by the background land reform discussion. Apart from curiously picking up on one point from earlier on, where Scotland bans you from letting for between 5 and 10 years. That's simply legally impossible in Scotland. So 5-year lets are what they get at that point because of the way the law is done. But it's the unsettled. People are not willing to put themselves into an inflexible position because of the legislative risk they see from the trend in legislation, the talk about an absolute right to buy and all of that. So there is an element in this which says actually give people absolute confidence in where they are now. And probably something like the proposed land use tenancy in Scotland may be very positive as a signal for many landowners there, particularly on these agroecological fronts. I view that as a very positive, potentially, it's got to get through the legislative mill, but potentially a very positive statement by the Scottish Government in this. I think the next point's already been touched on from behind you, which is people will have more confidence to act if they feel they aren't risking being caught in a trap. And we've had the trap with the Forestry Act that your use as forestry is then permanent, which is where there are background discussions about is short rotation forestry or indeed some of the agro-environmental forestry, can that be not permanent, precisely to help it be planted and be permanent. I mean, that's the irony about this. But the trap of fearing designation is something that, you've talked about the stone curlew, but I've picked this up in a lot of owner discussion around biodiversity net gain agreements, even if quite a lot of them would never actually trigger it because they wouldn't be that significant a change. But it's that sense, because what really drives quite a lot of people in this world is freedom for their heirs. I mean, some people like to tie their heirs down, but actually it's one of the things that comes up in discussing length of tenancy with an owner is I'm happy to let for as long as it takes, but I don't want to freeze it for my heirs. And here it's people looking at, well, what will my children want in 2053? And that's more of a shadow than quite often for some of them than anything in the nearer immediate future. So I think do nothing, affirm confidence, but limit the number of straitjackets people can get themselves into.
And I would disagree with Jeremy. In in the sense that you should always change what's bad and try and move to a better position, and recognize what the possible unintended consequences of that change might be. But you have to make reasonable change, and you have to change in the right areas. So, for example, Jeremy refers to Scotland. So there was the whole debate about the right to buy. We had a preemptive right to buy. There was a discussion about the absolute right to buy. We had a group of tenants in Scotland who wanted to go for the right to buy, whereas in England we said actually a landlord-tenant system requires there to be a landlord and a tenant. So why would we want to have a right to buy to dislodge the person who's offering the opportunity? So that's why we've got a separate organisation in Scotland, because they wanted the right to buy. So we thought that was a change too far. I mean, there are other changes in the taxation framework that Jeremy and I disagree about all the time in relation to nudging for longer terms, etc. I think the area that you have highlighted is one of the areas, though, where we don't need legislative change, because the legislation is quite helpful already. My concern is that the valuers need to do some CPD on looking at the new values that are emerging, how you find those new values, and how you be more literate about the landscape that we are creating in terms of value, so that we are properly valuing things on the way out rather than where we did it 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago.
But I think there is a point in this not to be misled, that just because academic economists have developed a concept called natural capital, like social capital, like human capital, that it has a realizable financial value that will persuade a bank manager or anybody else. It tells a story. And it depends where you take your definition of natural capital. Because if you recognize that trees and sheep are natural capital, which in academic economics they would be, they're traded fully in the marketplace. People have been doing that for years. The other things like clean air and so on are much, much harder to crystallize into something where there is an anchorable value that is tenable. And in a lot of the sort of proxy valuations that people do to work up natural capital valuations, broadly the rule of thumb should be the larger the figure is, the hairier are the assumptions on which it's based. And I think that it is, so the Forestry Commission, for example, produced very large figures, very good for its conflict with the Treasury over its existence, but actually that adds nothing to its economic reach, albeit it's another way of expressing some of the other qualities and values that it has. And so ways of helping understanding things, ways of making decisions, some of this can be very useful. But to simply read across that because somebody uses the word capital means that you can crystallize something to impress a bank manager is another story. We are in moving times, and I entirely agree with George that some of this is going to be part of what will persuade Morrison's to buy your beef and not somebody else's. And if that starts inhering in the holding, that then is something that attracts value to the holding and it works through. But these are emergent things, and not everything here that glisters is gold.
Right, we've overstayed our time here significantly. So thank you very much for coming and for staying in the heat. And thank you to Jeremy and to George.
Thank you for listening. We'd like to thank our lead sponsor, Sainsbury's, and our other major sponsors, Farmers Weekly Transition, Forestry Commission, and Till Hill, and all the attendees for making this show such an overwhelming success. To get advice and support for your agroforestry project, either visit woodlandtrust.org.uk/plant or soilassociation.org/agroforestry.